Welcome to Pensar Basketball Live. We're going to try this again. This live was supposed to be scheduled for 3 o'clock, but we had some technical issues. What is Buffettology? What am I talking about? Why am I bringing up finance when it comes to basketball? Well, if you've been following the Toronto Raptors, they've rebuilt this thing on the fly. 2 years ago, we were facing a bit of a problem. We had a lot of very overvalued players that were seeking to be compensated for what they believed to be fair market value. They were champions like Pascal Siakam, champions like Fred VanVleet, and champions like OG Anunoby, who fulfilled a very valuable, very in demand archetype. And the first deviation from this the first shift in focus for the Toronto Raptors would have been the Toronto Raptors trading with the New York Knicks. First of all, why are you trading with the New York Knicks? Well, it's interesting when you found out that the Toronto Raptors had traded OG Anunoby to the New York Knicks. If you were like me, you probably expected a bevy of picks back, and they didn't get those picks. Instead, they got Immanuel Quickley, RJ Barrett, and a second rounder. You can't even extract one first rounder. Some of us thought, but some others thought, hey, maybe there's something of value in these second draft guys. So let's talk about finance. Let's talk about Buffettology. Let's talk about what it all means and why I believe the Toronto Raptors have completely shifted focus and why I think it's going to pay extreme dividends. So, first, we got to talk about assets. Now, I don't know if you're a finance buff, if you are someone who studied finance, if you're someone who thinks about your life in terms of assets. Do you think of your car as an asset? Do you think of it as a liability? I assure you that the people who run this team and the people who run most teams have a very strong command of business language. So I figured it might be really valuable to ask, why is the asset so cheap? Now, this applies pretty much to, I'm going to use this mainly as a basketball thing, but this is like applicable across life. Okay. So, specifically, as it pertains to, did I just inadvertently answer a phone call? Yes, I did. Okay. As it specifically pertains to the NBA, here are some reasons that an asset might be cheap. It's actually trash. It's cheap because it's bad. Number two, the asset or player in this situation is playing the wrong position. Maybe it's a five who should be playing three. Maybe it's a three who should be playing five. Number three, bad team bias. Some players play on really bad teams. Kelly Oubre is a great example of that. He played for the Charlotte Hornets. He put up big numbers, ended up getting a minimum contract with the Sixers. Number four, under scouting bias. There are a lot of players who just slip through the ranks. They're not five-star recruits. Maybe they're not even four-star recruits. Derek White comes to mind. Then there's the overscouting bias. What do I mean by an overscouting bias? It means sometimes a college pro or an NBA player just gets dissected to death, and we just see too much of their weaknesses, and we can no longer even objectively see their strengths. Number six is the wrong system and the wrong coach. We'll look at examples of this, but it has been proven that every player is not built for every coach. Every player is not built for every system. Number seven, contractual situation and injuries. We'll look at examples for all of these and we'll think about examples for all of these, but that's pretty self evident, right? A player with an injury history like Steph Curry may be a little bit devalued early in his career, but then when he gets healthy and he starts playing well, suddenly he becomes very inflated in terms of his value. Contractual situation is the same thing. A player who is edging on the end of their rookie contract is going to have maybe less value than a player who is at the start of their rookie contract. Number eight, team contention arc. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Maybe, you have a team like the Minnesota Timberwolves with Leonard Miller. They don't necessarily see the same value in Leonard Miller as the rest of the league. He's in their G League. He's probably too good for G League, but he's not good enough to play on their team. Number nine is poor development. Just, maybe it's a player that just hasn't developed right. And number 10 is it's not fashionable. What that player does is not sexy. What that player does may not be in demand. Maybe it's an aging skill set, like a Jahlil Okafor, who was a top 3 pick for the Sixers, but suddenly his style went out of fashion. Let's think about some examples of these types of players, and you'll understand where I'm going with the Raptors. So, examples of distressed assets. So, a lottery pick who hasn't worked out. Can I think of lottery picks who haven't worked out? I mean, there's tons on the Raptors, But to use a more historical example, what about a Chauncey Billups, who was a top 3 pick, and he just didn't work out in his first stop? What about a Darko Milicic, who frankly, was a bust in Detroit, but became a pretty serviceable center for some part of his career before going back to Europe in Minnesota? It's different. You have to sometimes go through the rigmarole. You have to go through, and teams are always looking for second draft guys. People are always looking for guys. And in the past, the Raptors have taken flyers on Anthony Bennett, who was a first overall pick. They took a flyer on Stanley Johnson. You have to pick the right players, but you have to bring them into the right situation. Number two, a player who has not demonstrated shooting progress. I think Ochai Agbaji would probably fit into this category. Jalen Suggs, maybe 2 years ago, would have fit into this category. Just a player who is not progressing correctly, especially when the thing that they're not progressing in is something as valued as shooting. Number three, undersized players. I mean, Draymond Green didn't get traded, but were it not for Steve Kerr, there's a really good chance that Draymond Green just does not carve out the role that he did. You take a look at certain players and they're just a little bit undersized for their position. A guy like Isaiah Thomas comes to mind, right? He was with the Sacramento Kings. I think he was the 59th or 60th pick in the draft, and then he goes on to really garner MVP buzz with the Celtics. He was undersized. We tend to undervalue people who are a little bit undersized. We tend to overlook them. Fred VanVleet was overlooked partially because he was undersized. If Fred VanVleet was 6'3", Fred VanVleet would be a lottery pick. Fred VanVleet was like 6 feet. And again, there's a plethora of reasons why we overvalue or undervalue players. This goes right back to the concepts of Moneyball in that movie, but I think it's worth noting. A cheap asset that's soon to become expensive. I think a really good example of this was OG Anunoby and Pascal Siakam. The Toronto Raptors had these guys under team control, and they very easily could have signed them back. But maybe the Raptors did not value OG Anunoby at a $42 million, $38 million contract. Maybe they wanted him at $30 million. And once they saw that he was going to become overpriced, he became less valuable to them. But for a team like the New York Knicks that are on a different timeline, maybe they don't mind paying OG Anunoby. It also matters that what the rest of your team construct is, right? Jamal Murray, Michael Porter Jr., those two players on the Denver Nuggets are maybe not as they're a lot more valuable to the Denver Nuggets than they are to the rest of the league. I'll tell you that, because the minute you remove them from the context of Nikola Jokic MVP and you put them on Charlotte, they're suddenly very overpaid. Consider an often injured player. Again, I gave the example of Steph Curry, but there are plenty of examples of players who have injury history early in their career and they go on to be pretty healthy. Number 7, a coaching clash. I should have said clash, off-court issues. So examples of this include the Raptors' own Terrence Davis, right? There was an off-court issue there. The Raptors didn't want to touch it. Sacramento got a pretty good player for a little bit. There are other examples. Latrell Sprewell, there's plenty of issues where maybe a player burns their bridges in one market, but they can start fresh in a new market. 8, one-way players who lack theoretical two-way upside. I'm obviously talking about Davion Mitchell, right? Can you develop the offense? We shall see. Number 9, too many years, too many dollars. RJ Barrett, 100%. This is the example. The New York Knicks probably would not have traded RJ Barrett had he flashed any level of upside that he's shown with Toronto. If he could have shown that he could be a reliable corner shooter, they would have loved to have him. He would have been really great for their offense. He might have been able to do a lot of the stuff that Mikal Bridges can do minus the defense, but they decided to move off of him because it's too many years, too many dollars, and it was a cap hindrance. What about number 10, a player who brings less obvious value? I think an example of this could be Ochai again. When you think about Ochai Agbaji as a shooter and a defender, you lose some of the value of what he provides as a versatile defender. You lose a lot of the value of what he provides as a transition athlete. You also lose some of the value that he provides as just a locker room guy. You definitely lose a lot of the value that he provides as a cutter. If you have an offense that does not require a lot of cutting, you're not really going to see the value there. Let's move on. Why is the asset so expensive? It's so funny how these things are almost flipped, right? It's actually good. The player is valued because they're really good. Nikola Jokic, Anthony Edwards, these are good players. They're actually super expensive because they're good. They're playing in the right position. Yeah, they've been unlocked. They're in the right system for their strengths and for their skills. Tyrese Halliburton in Indiana is a great example. Tyrese Halliburton to Sacramento meant a lot less than Tyrese Halliburton, next to De'Aaron Fox, next to, Malik Monk potentially. That meant a lot less to them than he does currently to Indiana, and hopefully he can turn it around. Playing the right position, so good team bias. Sometimes players get very overvalued because they're just on good teams. And we just assume that if a player is on a good team and they're playing a lot of minutes, that they must be contributing to that good team. So much of this comes down to how much GMs can really sell their own team on it. And it tends to be that a player who just came off a championship is going to be way more valuable than the player who just came out of a second round exit, even if they had very little, if anything, to do with that championship. And I'm not trying to dismiss Bruce Brown's, valuable role on the Denver Nuggets championship, but removing him from the Nikola Jokic context of everything, it certainly does not yield $23 million of value. But that's unfortunately what the Indiana Pacers paid, and what the Raptors have inherited is a player who is worth way more because he won 2 years ago. What about the media hype bias? I'm sure Bronny James is worth a lot more today than an average 55th overall pick. He's talked about a lot. I'm sure Cade Cunningham is worth more than a lot of number one picks who are better than him, largely because he was super hyped. So, eventually there's kind of like a poison pill where this kind of flings the other way. When you're overhyped, you can become undervalued really quickly. But I do think that sometimes when a player is talked about a lot, especially if that player is like an Austin Reeves, playing in a really big market can sometimes inflate your value relative to the rest of the league. Austin Reeves is still a basketball player. If you remove him from the context of being the white guy on the Lakers, maybe he loses some of his cachet. But nevertheless, that's not really influencing the dollars and cents of how his market value is perceived around the league. What about small sample bias? Players can become very expensive because they have a really, really good stretch. Maybe it's a really good early stretch. Maybe it's a healthy stretch. Maybe it's a player who missed a ton of time in their rookie season. Right now, Grady Dick is a great example of a small sample bias. Grady Dick may not be the player that we have seen through the first 9 games. He may also be a much better player than we've seen in the first 9 games. However, Grady Dick's value from the start of the season to this current point has probably gone up about 100%. Is that just because he's really good, or is that because 9 games has made him look that good? What about the right system, right coach? Same thing as the wrong system, wrong coach, right? The player is just super optimized in this situation. Cheap, healthy, and marketable. Man, sometimes a player is just Cooper Flag. It's a perfect example. Super marketable, no injury concerns, very cheap relative to value. That's why draft picks are worth so much, because they're cheap, relatively healthy, at least in the variable sense, and marketable. You can sell your franchise on, we just got the third overall pick. That presents a lot of hope. That helps you sell tickets, especially early on. It helps you get a lot of renewals. Good development. So the asset is expensive because they have developed correctly. A case could be made for someone like Norman Powell or someone like an OG Anunoby. It's expensive because the Raptors developed him. And the number 10 is very fashionable. So this is a copycat league, right? We have a team that wins with a big center. Suddenly big centers become overvalued. We have a team that wins with an undersized point guard. Suddenly your undersized point guard becomes a little bit more fashionable. You have a team like the Boston Celtics that just won bombing threes over everybody, and they kind of proved this theory that you can just spam three-pointers all across the league and you can win championships. Well, suddenly 3-point shooting becomes slightly more valuable. It's fashionable, which also means, maybe if you're a player that doesn't shoot threes, you're a little less fashionable. There are examples. Josh Giddey, off-court issues, controversy, bad fit. Chicago Bulls, they get a young asset. They get a 6th overall pick for a middle-aged, I'll say NBA terms, middle-aged defensive role player, right? Alex Caruso probably, in theory, is a better player than Josh Giddey. Of course, relatively as assets. Could you have gotten Alex Caruso for the 6th overall pick? Could you have gotten the 6th overall pick back in 2021 for Alex Caruso when Kuminga, Franz Wagner, all these guys were on the board? Hell no. You couldn't have gotten it. You would have had to throw a futures first. But that's the problem. When a player does not develop correctly, when they're developed in a log jam, when they have off-court issues, they become undervalued. The other example would be this fellow, Dyson Daniels, one of my favorite young players. I've been talking about the Raptors trading for Dyson Daniels for years. I even talked about trading one of my favorite players, OG Anunoby, for him, pretty much in a straight swap. And the reason for that was he was buried. He was buried behind players who did a lot of the same stuff that he did. He was buried behind Brandon Ingram, a wing, buried behind Jordan Hawkins, a better shooter than him, buried behind, to some extent, Trey Murphy and Herb Jones, really good defenders. And you just saw him and you're like, man, small samples, he looks great. So again, they're undervalued, right? Let's continue with some historical examples of undervalued players who blossomed. Drazen Petrovic is a great example. Drazen Petrovic was scoring 100 points over in Europe. Great player, but went to Portland, played behind Terry Porter and a lot of other really good guards, Clyde Drexler. They had players in his position. And, people back home, Croatia, Serbia, etc., were distressed and some were confused to see him playing 5, 6, 7 minutes and being happy with it. But ultimately, and if you want more context into this and you want a little bit more insight into this story, definitely go watch Vlada Divac's, I think, 30 for 30 documentary Once Brothers, which highlights how much he sort of languished in Portland. But boom, put him in a different situation. The Nets, they have a star, and he became the best player on the Nets. So he's a good example of this. But it's another good example of this: a future Finals MVP like Chauncey Billups, who's currently here wearing a Toronto Raptors jersey. How many teams passed on Chauncey Billups? I mean, Rick Pitino traded this guy within half a season, and he was a top 3 pick. He didn't want him. And you know what? It's Moneyball, right? Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And I'm going to show you why the Toronto Raptors are doing this. But first, I got to give you a little bit of an intro into Buffettology 101. First of all, huge Warren Buffett fan. Warren Buffett changed my life in a lot of ways. I was just a kid. I was a poor kid who was trying to figure this out, right? I was trying to figure out how to become rich because, everyone around me was poor and on food stamps. And so I came across a whole bunch of Warren Buffett books when I was much younger, including Buffettology, Snowball Effect, and stuff like that. And, these books have shaped my life throughout most of my life. Listening to Warren Buffett talk about value investing, finding value where other people don't see value, old adages like when there's blood on the street, buy property, etc., have made me realize that the average person has no idea when to buy, when to sell anything. But I want to give you a bit of a crash course into Buffettology, and you'll bear with me for a second as I give you tools to unlock your life. Okay, so this is from Value Spreadsheet, and this is going to be a 2 to 3 minute detour away from basketball and into the concept of value investing. Okay, so a different view on value. That's what Buffett does. That's why Buffett does not necessarily look at the discount to intrinsic value, but instead focuses on the so-called annual compounding rate of return. So that's consistently just baking in like future value. This sounds more difficult than it really is. All this rate really tells you is how much you can expect to earn each year by purchasing stocks of a certain company at a certain price. To figure this out, you'll need to estimate how much a company should realistically be worth 5 years from now, and such an estimate is only possible if the company has consistent earnings. So, quote, without some predictability of future earnings, any calculation of future value is mere speculation. And yikes, hold on one sec. Calculation of a future value is mere speculation, and speculation is an invitation to folly. Okay. So, here are some takeaways, 10 important lessons from Buffettology. And I think that you could use these in your life in a very significant way. And we will get to basketball right after this and show you just how the Raptors are using this. But let's just take a look here. 10 important lessons. First, determine what you want to own, then wait for a good price. The price you pay determines your rate of return. That's common sense, right? So, number 2, to be able to determine your rate of return, earnings and profitability should not be above average, but also should not only be above average, but also predictable. Number 3, Warren Buffett does not calculate the intrinsic value and then buys at half price. Instead, he calculates the expected annual compounding rate of return, compares it with other available investments, and buys the best one. 4, only buy a company if it is excellent and consistent business economics and expected annual compounding rate of return is 15% or higher. Then hold on to the stock for as long as possible to maximize the compounding. Honestly, man, if you can't see the parallels to what the Raptors are doing here, you're crazy. Okay, number 5, compounding is the number one secret to getting rich. Compounding long and hard with minimum taxes and fees. So limit your number of transactions. Number 6, prefer to hold on to a great business with a predictable, consistent 20% return over a quick 35% gain, because the former is hard to find and the selling means you have to pay taxes. Number 7, consumer monopolies does not apply necessarily. Number 8, dividends only make sense, does not apply. go to number 9 and number 10. Hang on one sec. You can definitely stop this and read it whenever you want. Excellent businesses are often industry leaders and tend to have low debt levels, large cash flows, and strong brand names, low maintenance and running costs, high quality products and services, an increasing book value, strong earnings, shareholder friendly management, and a consumer monopoly. Number 10, other people's money is the only way to become ridiculously rich from investing. The book states in order to become a billionaire, you have to get other people to give you their money to invest. Okay. There is an old adage, buy blood when there's basically buy property when there's blood on the streets, even if the blood is your own, from Baron Rothschild. This really just changed my mind a lot. When I was working at a hedge fund and just generally speaking, when I got into finance when I was 18, I realized that people sold at the stupidest times. I also realized that people bought at the stupidest times. And generally speaking, buying and selling is very counterintuitive. Yesterday, I posed the thought of buying low on Scoot Henderson, and I proposed trading a couple of first round picks to get it done. And of course, taking on a little bit of salary, which had some flexible value like Jeremy Grant, Ryan Rupert, and Matisse Thybulle, players who maybe fit better with the Toronto Raptors than they do with their current situation for the Portland Trailblazers. And largely, of course, this is not me, getting very, very excited about what I've seen from Scoot Henderson. It is largely the prospect of what Scoot could be in a different situation with a better development staff. Of course, there are certain situations where nothing grows and you have to investigate. You have to do your own due diligence, right? There are certain companies which are going to undergo a massive upheaval in terms of, corporate restructuring and their expected value based on who the CEO is and who they bring in. So you have to have like a really good pulse on what is happening with each prospect. So to use the example of Scoot Henderson right now, the outlook is so bearish. It's so bearish, right? People are talking about him like he might be the worst player, like the worst number 3 pick ever. He's such a bust. He's made no progress. He's a below the rim athlete, etc. I'm watching this guy and I'm like, I see something else. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. I could be wrong. It's not a lot to give up for him, but it's worth a shot. I have seen what Darko Rajakovic has done with players considerably less talented than Scoot, and I'm seeing all of them develop. Is it crazy to assume that Scoot might become the best version of them yet? Is it crazy to assume that Scoot Henderson could probably take all the notes that Immanuel Quickley is doing right now, but he'd just be a bigger, stronger version of that? Who's to say? But ultimately, everybody wants to buy the super hyped prospect. Everyone wants to buy the player at the apex, and that's the wrong time to buy, right? The Knicks bought on OG and Anunoby probably at the wrong time, right? But, I mean, you could argue they bought at the right time. He was expiring. The Raptors were desperate to sell. Okay, fine. The Knicks did a good job. But you could argue the Raptors bought on Jakob Poeltl at the wrong time because they were trying to do one thing and the Spurs were trying to do another thing, and the incentive was completely washed. And so the Raptors overcompensated a team that was looking to shed salary anyway and probably looking to tank. So I don't think that the Raptors read that situation super well. But of course, their own desperation made them desperate. That being said, very often the thing that most fans want to do is the wrong thing, right? Most fans, a lot of fans, I'm gonna be honest with you, a lot of fans right now, two years ago, wanted to trade Scotty Barnes for Kevin Durant, which probably, in hindsight, is the wrong move, and I was very against it. Last summer, a lot of fans wanted to trade Scotty Barnes for Damian Lillard. Again, wrong move. Scotty was coming off a really bad year. You have a distressed asset. They have an inflated asset. They probably not even doing that swap straight up. So, you know what I mean? Like, you are the one who is desperate here, right? You're trying to recoup some value on an asset that's failing. And then this summer, right? Sorry, right now, there's a lot of fans who want to trade Scotty Barnes in a package for Giannis Antetokounmpo. Why? What are you doing? Right? So it's timing all of it, but I do think that it's important to second guess the intuitiveness of when you're buying things. How do you find value? There's a lot of different ways to find value, but I think the most important way is to be really coherent about your value structure and maybe value different things than other people value, right? It's really hard. to do business in the NBA when every single team is great at doing business, right? This is an old adage from, a lot of GMs that have echoed the sentiment that it really helps to have one or two teams that really don't know what they're doing, and ideally you want 6, 7 teams that don't know what they're doing. So, for instance, you have a team like the Utah Jazz. You're probably not going to milk something great from them, which is what makes the Ochai Agbaji, extraction so amazing. But in theory, Danny Ainge is a really good judge of talent. Very likely, if he's making a player available, it's almost likely that he's probably available for a reason. And if he's holding on to a player, he's probably holding on to him for a reason. So you have to find value by valuing things that Danny Ainge doesn't value, maybe even valuing things that other people don't value. Maybe you're the type of team that really values a certain metric that other teams aren't looking at. Maybe you're a team that really has a style of play that is very different from other teams, and you have a different way to employ these players. A good example is RJ Barrett. I think that is just the perfect example because RJ Barrett in a half court only offense in which he's a corner shooter maybe is just going away from his strengths, but RJ Barrett in the transition game. So you start to extract games, plays in which RJ Barrett plays the way you envision him playing. And then you judge his success and failure only in those games or only on those plays. And you say, well, what if we could build this out to a larger sample size? Finding value is also in terms of, beauty in the eye of the beholder, that sort of thing, right? When you look at a guy who maybe is, I don't know, 6'5", and you see they see an undersized wing. Sorry, they see an undersized big. You see an oversized wing. That's a good case with Jonathan Mogbo, right? Everybody else saw a guy who doesn't take threes, right? Everybody else saw a guy who's playing center and he's 6'6", and people saw no pipeline or pathway for him to be a valuable NBA player, which is why he slipped in a really weak draft, even though the analytics said that he shouldn't. And he is really good. He is number 13 in terms of the pest rating. He has been positive in almost every single game he's played. He's been the Raptors, probably one of the most valuable, if not their most valuable defender. So how are the Raptors consistently finding volume and value? Consider a guy like Pascal Siakam, who didn't take a lot of threes in college. I don't know how many threes he took, but certainly was not projected by many scouts to be a three-point shooter. Where did the Raptors find value or see value in Pascal Siakam? I think they saw value in the fact that they knew him longer, they knew of him longer, so they had a better pipeline and better track record. This is something we discussed with Ulrich Chomche as well. When Joe Tuamu came on, he said the Raptors did their homework early. Sure, the Raptors had a bigger piece of the data puzzle when it came to Ulrich. They knew where he was when he was 14, how he's developed from 14 to 18. And that created a much fuller picture as opposed to just being me, not knowing about him until he was 17 or 18 years old, watching one game and saying, this guy's terrible. You can't say someone is terrible in a vacuum. You have to understand the full progress, and maybe that's value. Ulrich was also buried away from the world, right? He was in NBA Africa. He was in Senegal. How many scouts are going to Senegal? How many scouts are going to Italy? How many scouts are going to Serbia? How many scouts are going to France, right? Maybe one of the reasons that Bilal Coulibaly shot up draft boards and went 7th instead of in the second round was because people saw him so much because of Victor Wembanyama. Do you ever think about what would have happened with Bilal Coulibaly in the draft had he not played on the same team as Victor Wembanyama? He probably slips. He almost definitely slips to the Raptors at 13. If doesn't slip to the Raptors at 13, maybe he slips all the way to the end of the first round. And suddenly we're talking about Bilal Coulibaly the same way we're talking about someone like Toumani Camara, who slipped to the second round, right? So you got to find value. And that just means you got to be better researched than other people. You got to have a different set of values. You got to be very clear about your assertion of values. And I think that is very, very underrated part of team building. Number 2, the worst assets held. I mean, what is the worst asset to hold? I guess the worst asset to hold is a declining asset when you don't need it. I think another asset to hold is maybe someone like, can y'all give me examples of what you think is a worst asset to hold? Maybe an aging player on a bad deal. I think Jeremy Grant would probably be a pretty bad asset to hold. I think Bradley Beal, like guys like this, right? I think there are certain examples where you just look at that and you're like, that asset is worth more now than it will be in a week. draft picks are also a pretty bad asset to hold. I'll tell you why. So when the Portland Trail Blazers used the third overall pick, I would like to see the DMs and the calls that they got from teams looking to use that third overall pick. Now, almost every single GM who was calling them was going to be looking to trade up to number 3 for Scoot Henderson. And when he slipped from 2 to 3, because it was largely considered Scoot was the number 2 player in this draft until Brandon Miller rose up, suddenly there's like a thought that, hey, the Charlotte Hornets have made this really huge mistake. Someone can capitalize on it. It raises the price of that third overall pick. I don't know right now, if I'm thinking about it, did the Portland Trail Blazers have an offer for like 4 future firsts? Scoot Henderson would be very lucky to fetch 3 future firsts today. I think he'd be very lucky to fetch 2 future firsts today. It's a little bit like buying a car, right? A car is not an asset. It is a liability. Some players, in a weird way, if they go the other way, it's not really an asset, it's a liability. And you consider a player like, I don't know, a Jakob Poeltl is a great example, right? Yak, when you traded for him, was a significant asset. He was making $9 million. He was a little bit younger. Now he's a little bit older and he's making $20 million and he's on a super bloated deal. Is Jakob Poeltl worth more today or was he worth more 2 years ago? He was definitely worth more 2 years ago. And you think you have to do a really good job of projecting your assets and holding value. I think that's important. And right now, if Jakob Poeltl goes to the bench because the Raptors find that it's untenable to work with a starting big, that value will plummet even more, right? So this is probably why the Raptors value flexibility as much as they do. I think it's important to realize that assets are not constant, that the value of a particular player is not constant, and that you can rehabilitate it. An example of this is Davion Mitchell, right? Davion Mitchell at the draft. What was that 9th overall pick worth? It was worth probably a lot, actually. If I had to scale the value from a scale of 0 to 100, 100 being what you would get for Giannis, and 0 being what you would currently get for Zach LaVine, I would argue that Davion Mitchell, before he became Davion Mitchell, the 9th overall pick that the Sacramento Kings held at that draft, largely probably because some team was looking up to trade draft Alperen Sengun, or maybe some team was bullish on the fact that Franz Wagner would fall, or maybe some team was super high on Chris Duarte or Trey Murphy. I think that pick probably was worth like 40, whatever the hell, 35. Okay, 35, 30, 35. Let's put it at 35. The second they selected Davion Mitchell, an older guy who was a bit of a reach, that value fell to like 20. So it was like within 4 minutes. So from when they were on the clock to when they made that selection, they plummeted the value because a lot of people didn't think Davion was worth that 9th overall pick. And now you see Davion in the NBA and you hope some of that value can be recouped when he turns out to be good. But he doesn't turn out to be good. Instead, he goes the other way and he's bad. And to the point where now, 3 years later, you're trading him and his value is 0. So you turned an asset that was worth 35, immediately flipped it into 20, turned it into 15, 10, 0. Now the Raptors have the task of turning 0 back into like 15. Can we get to 15? Can we turn Davion Mitchell from a 0 to a 15? I would argue that every single player that the Raptors have done a second draft with, and we'll talk about those players individually just in a moment, have actually rehabilitated some essence of their value. Not all of it, but some of it. Yesterday's price is not today's price. And that's the point, right? Once you put players in different contexts, like in Immanuel Quickley, their value around the league changes. There's still some people right now that talk about Immanuel Quickley as a backup guard because that's how they know him. They haven't seen him in Toronto. But wait till Toronto rises and he's a 22 point per game scorer. You will have turned what a lot of people consider to be an undersized, maybe pricey, looking to be pricey, overpriced guard. To this point, people are clowning the $32.5 million deal. What if Immanuel Quickley pops for you? He might be one of the better contracts in the NBA if he starts bombing threes the way I think he can. So again, let's take a look at some of the stats here. And most importantly, take a look at his last year with New York, and then take a look at what happened to those numbers in Toronto. Okay. Now, it's worth noting that Immanuel Quickley actually is one of those players that did not really have a better time with Toronto, at least last year, than he did with New York. He struggled with a new system, and you're going to see this trend with, Ochai as well. The first year, not so good, adjusting to a new load, adjusting to a new minute, and suddenly we're seeing a slight decline across the board. So we saw like relatively even in terms of 3-point attempts, right? I don't think the numbers changed too drastically. In fact, he took fewer 3-point attempts per 100 possession with the Raptors. He shot the same percentage. He's so consistent, 39.5%. The 2-point percentage, I mean, it dipped from 51% to 44%, 45%. And the free throw percentage dipped a little bit. The rebounds went up a little bit. The assists doubled, though. And that's the point. He turned himself from a shooting guard into a point guard because that's kind of what his role was in New York. And that's the utility people were seeing, a shooting guard who's undersized despite the wingspan and kind of just fits more into that Jamal Crawford role. And now you're trying to reimagine him as a lead initiator, and that's a completely different role. And he struggled with that. I suspect that this year he's going to command that role much better. And suddenly you've taken a 6'2, undersized, plus wingspan, 24-year-old who's off the bench and projects more as a plus size Lou Williams. And you've turned that into a lead initiator that can command maybe some sub all-star buzz. And I think that that's just a very different equation in terms of the type of player we're talking about. Again, the analytics dipped a little bit, but you'll see this year and hopefully next year how much he can progress. And again, at the age of 25, 26, he will still be entering his prime. So you took a chance on a player who was super young. And what about RJ Barrett? Now, this is a story that paid immediate dividends. It did not take a year for RJ Barrett to get better. He literally got better right away. Per 100 possessions between the Raptors and the Knicks, it was relatively even. What was not relatively even was the field goal percentage, which jumped up by 13% last year. Now, this year, the field goal percentage is down a little bit because he's been shouldering a much bigger load. But if you look at his New York Knicks versus Toronto Raptors 3-point percentage, went from 33 to 39. This year, early on, he was shooting plus 40%, had a couple cold games, so now he's down to 36%. Still a vast improvement. What is the biggest improvement is his playmaking. The same thing as Immanuel Quickley. You have turned him into a much more toolsy player. With the Knicks, he averaged 4.1 assists per 100 possessions. Went to 5.9 last year. He's up to 10.1 right now. That is a fundamentally different player. That is a type of player that can be like a third star, as opposed to a fifth starter who does not provide a lot of spacing, which is like the worst player archetype. If you look at the advanced numbers, with the Knicks, he was a -2 boxes minus. Last year with the Raptors, positive 0.1. This year, positive 0.3. Can he push it up to positive 1.5 when Scotty returns? Well, that is a very different player. That's a very different player, especially when you account for the fact that, he has shown for the last year that he's a much better shooter than he was with the Knicks. Can he become a good defender? That will also be a huge thing. Now, Ochai Agbaji, this is a player that went completely the other way until he went the right way. If you look at Ochai's numbers with the Utah Jazz, we're talking a guy who averaged per 100 possessions. He was averaging 13.2 points per game, and he wasn't very efficient. 43% from the field, 42.6% from the field, 33% from three. This is a player who was really, really on his last legs here. And he was only in his second NBA year, So it's like, wow, we're giving up on players this quickly right now. He's a member of the 2022 draft class, a year after Scotty, and he's just 24 years old, or he's 23 last year. And the Utah Jazz were like, nah, we're good. You can have him. And the Raptors exchanged a first round pick in exchange for that. And a lot of people were really upset because Ochai Agbaji struggled last year. So for the Raptors, that field goal percentage went down by 3%, but that 3-point percentage, which was already a terrible 33.1%, went down to 21.7. Again, do your homework early. The Raptors have followed Ochai Agbaji for way too long to believe that he's a terrible shooter, and they just believed that they needed to tweak with his mechanics and really build up some confidence in him, and they trusted the development staff to make him better. And this year, he might be one of the most improved players in the league. Right now, career highs in points per 100 possessions. Y'all see the numbers. Career highs in steals per 100 possessions, assists per 100 possessions, rebounds per 100 possessions. A career high right now in 3-point percentage, 2-point percentage, a career high in box plus minus, a career high in offensive box plus minus, a career high in defensive box plus minus, a career high in win shares per 48. He is literally sparking across the board. Sparking. Okay. And so far, a career high in free throw rate as well. So he is doing a lot of good things. And defensively, he has been absolutely great. Okay. Vegan Grass saying IQ hasn't proved anything yet. So interestingly enough, I will flash something for you on the IQ spectrum. Hold on one second. Take a look. So if you look at Immanuel Quickley, there's two sides of Immanuel Quickley, and I just want you to specifically focus on the assist percentage in the advanced stats. So in his second year, they tried to convert him into more of a, let's call it, traditional playmaker. Okay. A guy who handles more pick and roll initiation duties, a guy who's doing more of the conventional creation for others stuff, right? Again, some coaches don't want you creating shots for others. They want you to be more of a play finisher. They want you to be more a spot up shooter. You have to understand these 3-point percentages are not the same. The way he's getting shots off is not the same. The types of threes he's generating, the type of offensive, in types of defensive coverages he's seeing is not the same. For him to hold water going from a sixth man on the Knicks to a full-time starter is immense. So I think he has shown plenty. But if you just look at that assist percentage, you will notice that that second year in New York, he struggled hard. His box plus minus went from 0.9 to 0.2 when they tried to make him more of an initiator. And then when they made him more of a scorer, so you'll see that assist percentage go from 16, and then there's an uptick to almost 25%. Then there's a downtick back to 17%. That's the suited role. Immanuel Quickley is a scorer. That's what Immanuel Quickley does. Immanuel Quickley was never anybody's definition of a great playmaker. If you can convert him into one and still hold his value equation changes drastically. So I do believe, I respectfully disagree with you. I do think that he has shown plenty. And I think Ochai Agbaji has shown plenty as well. Okay, let's get to, yeah. So, Davion Mitchell, that's the final second draft guy. And of course, this is the best trade in Raptors history because you not only got off a terrible player in Jalen McDaniels, you got 3 assets back for that player, which includes a second round pick in next year's draft from the Portland Trailblazers, Davion Mitchell and Jamal Shead. So you basically got 2 backup point guards and a huge hypothetical in that second round next year. And you gave up absolutely nothing. And oh, by the way, Sasha Vezenkov took a $0 buyout. So we're good. That's like the best deal ever. But notice how that deal even came about. That deal came about because the Sacramento Kings were desperate to accommodate DeMar DeRozan's contract request. They wanted to contend. They fancy themselves as a team that's a small market team that just missed the playoffs. How many extenuating circumstances had to come together for the Sacramento Kings to pull off this deal? They were so desperate to make this deal, and the Raptors just happened to be in the right place at the right time. They had the right cap situation. They had the right value structure. They valued Davion Mitchell, I guess, enough to see him as a useful role player. They also valued Jamal Shead, who was kind of forcing his way into outside the two-way market. And they also must have valued next year's draft. I mean, again, you got to project forward. But if you look at Davion Mitchell, this is a player, I mean, who is not really sparking great deals of upside. But I would say that he wasn't really a full-time starter in Sacramento. So the fact that his numbers haven't gotten abysmally worse as a starter is a huge sign of progress. Now he's shooting less than 30% from 3. That's not good. He's shooting 71% from the free throw line. That's not good. He's not really getting to the line very much. That's not great. His assists per 100 possessions is actually the lowest it's ever been, despite the fact that he's playing in our assist farming system, which probably tells you just how bad he's been. But it's worth noting that he's turning the ball over less than he's ever turned it over. And it's kind of funny that turnovers have been such a big issue with him when this is a career high for him. He's also not fouling that much more than last year. And that's crazy because we foul a ton. His win shares per 48 is down from last year. That's not great. And again, like overall, his usage is a little bit up from the last 2 years, but it's not high. So maybe he hasn't really grabbed the bull by the balls or whatever the hell you want to say. His true shooting percentage is right around career averages, a little bit above career averages. But I mean, honestly, that's largely it's not an improvement over last year. 3-point attempt rate is not an improvement over last year. The free throw attempt rate is not an improvement over last year. The rebound percentage is not an improvement. There's literally nothing he's doing this year that is better than last year, other than his steal percentage and block percentage. So he's been a little bit more active as a defender and overall. His turnover percentage, however, is insanely up. And you do wonder why that is. So how does his turnover, let me think about this. Turnovers per 100 possessions is not up, but his turnover percentage has spiked into double. So that just means he's handling the ball a lot more. Makes sense. So he's turning the ball over on 1 out of every 5 possessions. I mean, this is like Cade Cunningham territory, to be honest with you. Like, yes, that's bad because he doesn't do enough for you to warrant that high a turnover percentage. So I retract my previous statement about the turnovers per 100 possessions being lower. Um, yeah. Okay. Let's move on from that. And yeah, I mean, the jury is still out what he will become or what he can become. Now, who's next? Now, this is really, I think, very, very important to realize that the Raptors are not doing this as a one-off, right? This is their strategy right now. They're looking for value everywhere. Okay. And there's a very obvious form of value. Tank, get draft picks, get 10 draft picks, 15 draft picks, get 100 draft picks. That's the most obvious value because it's a convertible asset that doesn't apply to your cap sheet. So those assets are very valuable. But how valuable is an expiring contract? How valuable is your mid-level exception that can be traded? How valuable is scouting in Africa and having that pipeline, which a pipeline which has yielded you Pascal Siakam, has yielded you over Chomche, Precious Achua, which didn't really work out. There's plenty of players. Christian Koloko, who didn't really work out, but I mean, he's a solid player. So that's like one way of finding value. There's also value in just getting deeper into the draft, having scouts that are willing to look outside the box, think outside the box, scout lesser known conferences, get outside the blue bloods. There's a hype element to every draft pick, right? You have your Grady's and your Jacobys. These are the 5-star recruits that are super young, that can shoot. And these tend to be like very overvalued. There's a reason both of them slipped a little bit in the draft, and you just have to cross those t's and dot the i's for yourself in terms of, is that a concern for us? Is that something we believe we can fix? With Jacoby, maybe it was the thought that he's not the greatest playmaker for others, and maybe that's something that you believe, hey, that's a synergistic fit for us. We've improved every player as a playmaker. We can improve this guy as a playmaker. It's the same concept. And you look at a guy like Grady, and maybe there was maybe there's a little bit of bias. Maybe there's he doesn't look as athletic, but maybe you see his athleticism and you're like, you know what? We think he's plenty athletic. He just doesn't look athletic to the average eye. There's a lot of reasons where people get looked over. So who is the next, right? Because I do believe that the Raptors will continue doing this, whether they trade Bruce Brown, Chris Boucher, whether they trade their own picks, whether they trade the Indiana pick, whether they trade, Jakob Poeltl. At some point, you're going to see this entire thing play out again. And it seems to me that the Raptors are seeking value where other people are giving up on value. So you look at a player like Leonard Miller, Josh Minot, both players on the Minnesota Timberwolves. Those are the types of players that the Raptors really value. And maybe they're a lot more valuable to us than they are to the Minnesota Timberwolves. That's what you need. That's the tenets of what you need to make a deal. What you need to make a deal is for us to value what you're giving up more than you do, and for you to value what we're giving up more than we do. That's how the OG Anunoby deal came to fruition. The Knicks were in a position where they believed that they needed to build a contender around Jalen Brunson. And in order to circumvent all the issues of the CBA and the new apron or whatever, they needed to get OG Anunoby in the door because they wouldn't have the cap space to sign him outright. So you found a desperate seller, and we were able to turn OG Anunoby and 2 assets that we didn't care very much for and probably we're not going to bring back in Precious Achua and Malachi Flynn, who had sort of run out their developmental run. You know what I mean? Like Darko gave it a shot. We didn't see progress. We moved off, right? It was great. This is exactly how you should do it. And I believe that the Raptors should do this many times. I believe the Raptors should do this like 10 times over the next 2 years. Consider it an open tryout. Bring Davion in. He hasn't worked out so far. Maybe he has a great game tonight and a great game tomorrow, and suddenly we see a trend line shift with him. But after 25 games, if it hasn't worked out, feel free to move off and try your hand with another player. Continuously moving and trusting that you are doing what is necessary to put the player in a position to succeed. And if they are not succeeding in that situation, then having that will to move off of it quickly. I think that it is a great idea to consider where and why certain players are undervalued. Again, we brought it up. Maybe a player is just buried. Maybe a team has a massive injury where they've lost the center, and suddenly Jakob Poeltl is like worth 2 first-round picks to save their season, and he's the only big that does what he does that's available. You know what I mean? Like, that's very unlikely, and that's why you want players like Grady who kind of fit everywhere. That's why you want a player like OG who can just pretty much fit in anywhere. The convertibility of an asset is so important too, and the sort of portability of an asset is super valuable. OG Anunoby is worth, as a basketball player, I think he's worth around 22 to 23 million dollars. If you're being fair, he has a lot of offensive limitations. He's injury prone. Why did he get such a big contract? Got such a big contract because he's extremely rare. What he does is rare. A positionally versatile guy who can guard 4 to 5 positions, who can shoot threes, doesn't need the basketball, and fits into every single team scheme and fits into every single type of lineup is super rare. And they're going to pay for that. But if you only want to use him one way, it doesn't really matter that you can use him 100 different ways, right? He didn't fit into our system as well as he fits into the Knicks system, I think. That's sort of my prognosis. So you look at a guy like a Scoot Henderson, you look at a guy like Josh Minot, think about guys. Think about who fits into the Toronto Raptors system. Great cutters. Great cutters create great spacing, even when they can't shoot, especially if they can shoot, i.e., Grady Dick. Perfect fit. Consider what Ochai Agbaji is doing right now. Transition athlete who can cut, who can shoot. I mean, so far he can shoot. Put the ball in the hand, put the ball on the floor a little bit. Got a little bit of handle. Okay, perfect. That is the type of guy. He can guard up a few positions. He can guard down a couple positions. He could realistically guard 3 to 4 positions for you. That's huge. That's really big. That's something that the Raptors prioritize a lot. I venture to think that Ochai Agbaji is worth like a much better first round pick today than he was 9 months ago. 9 months. That's all it took to rehab Ochai's value. 9 months. And you can continue to rehab it. You can continue to rehab it until you're ready to move off of it. So you flip Chris Boucher to a team that is desperate to move off some salary because you have some salary years that you can eat. You have to have a clear perspective on when your timeline is. And so then everything must go back to the main thing, must remain the main thing. What is the main thing for the Toronto Raptors? You can feel free to venture a guess if you're watching this after. Let me know in the comments what you think the main thing is. I think the main thing is competing for championships, but I think the main thing is opening up a very realistic championship window that starts in a couple of years, especially when especially teams that are super pick depleted, like the Milwaukee Bucks, fall off the face of the earth. Maybe teams that have invested in star players like Cade Cunningham find out that those star players aren't real superstars and maybe they just become middle of the pack teams. And you're just trying to draw out a line of, just like Warren Buffett, what is this company going to be worth in a couple of years? Now we tie the whole thing together, the Buffettology of it. The reason that I found myself to be more successful financially in my early 20s than my peers was because I was willing to wait. I had a very distant vision of the future. I was trying to do things 10 years ahead, and I wasn't really trying to live in the moment. I wasn't really worried about a stock going down 5, 6%, nor was I overly excited about a stock going up 14 or 18%. I had a longer vision for what I was trying to do with my life. What I was trying to do with my life was change the destiny that poverty would not breed more poverty, would not breed more poverty. I was trying to change that. And I think what the Raptors are doing ultimately is looking down the window 3, 4 years from now, projecting what these players are, who they can become, how to get them there. See, any one of those things, if you project wrong, if you don't get them there, if you don't hire the right development staff, none of this works. So now you have what I consider free time. This is non-consequential time. This is time to experiment. This is time to do G League reps. This is time to play 4 rookies at once. You won't have this luxury 2 years from now. And you also won't have the luxury of being able to swap out pieces as often as the Raptors do. Every single time you create a trade, you disrupt team chemistry, you disrupt flow. Right now, you can flip Bruce Brown for something today and then flip that something for another thing at the deadline, which means you can take a look at like 7 different players over the course of a year. You can fit them into your locker room. You can see who sticks out. You can see that. You're not going to have that luxury of experimentation later on. Right now, you can try a lot of things. You can try Scotty at the point. You can try Scotty at the five. You can play Jacoby right now. A luxury you would not have if you were a contending team. The Philadelphia 76ers could not play Jacoby Walter right now unless they were absolutely injury depleted because he would be losing the minutes and they can't play him. So they would have to send him to the Delaware Bluecoats. You know what I mean? So it's things like that. Even an Ulrich Chomche, like maybe there will be some Ulrich minutes later on in the season if the Raptors are not competitive. These are important things. And right now, I'm looking at second draft guys. I'm looking at guys around the league. And I think we need to do a separate video for that where we take a look at the last 5 drafts. There's like at least 15 players that are sticking out to me like you wouldn't believe. And you're thinking to yourself, do they mean more to us? Could we do more with these players? Could we extract more value, development value? Could we accelerate some, suppressed development in these players that these other teams are not doing? And I think the teams to look at are the 2 types of teams. You don't want to look at middle of the pack teams that are kind of like trying to be in the playoffs. You're looking at 2 types of teams, well, 3 types of teams. So where do you find the value? And maybe this can be homework for you, and you can bring me back, like 10 players that you found that kind of fit the bill. One type of player is your Leonard Miller, a player who is maybe on a team that is contending, that isn't getting the opportunity, that maybe there isn't a realistic pathway. Maybe the team is kind of capped out. They have a lot of big salaries. So when that player comes up, they are reading the tea leaves on the wall that they're not going to be able to extend that player. And if they're a restricted free agent, some team is just going to be able to offer something to them. So maybe you see that as, hey, let's get ahead of restricted free agency instead of trying to sign this player to an offer sheet. Let's just try to trade for him a year before he expires off that rookie deal. And that way we can get him for a future first or something like that. So that's one type of player, is the good prospect on a really good team that's just sort of buried behind a lot of better older players. An example of this is actually Jermaine O'Neal, who was buried on the Portland Trailblazers. It's ironic that the Portland Trailblazers are the team that I'm talking about with Scoot Henderson, but they're also the team that traded away Drazen Petrovic, Zach Randolph. They're also the team that traded away Jermaine O'Neal. History has a way of repeating itself. Everyone gets injured in Portland, and everybody blossoms when they leave Portland. Is that true? Sometimes. So that's one type of player. The other type of player is just a player who maybe needs a fresh start, needs a change of scenery. I think Scoot fits this bill, but I think there are certain other players that maybe they're just not in the right situation. They're not with the right team. They're not in the right city. There's just something off about that situation, that fit. Talk to any trainer, talk to any, agent. The most important thing for a young player is not where they go, but where they go, right? It doesn't matter if you go 13th, 14th, 18th, 20th. Yeah, the money changes a little bit. It matters that you end up in a situation that's good for you spiritually, mentally, the team dynamic. The Raptors have like immaculate vibes. So if there is a player who's a little bit stressed out about being a pro, maybe there's a player who's feeling a lot of pressure about being a high lottery pick in their situation, this might be the situation where you can unlock them. You didn't know that under Nick Nurse because you couldn't unlock jack shit. But right now, you have the possibility to actually unlock that confidence that a player needs to be successful in the NBA. Scoot Henderson didn't just forget how to play basketball. Now, I don't want to keep going back on Scoot Henderson. There are probably 20 other players that make a lot more sense for the Raptors, but it just seems like a very obvious example of finding value. Jalen Suggs a couple of years ago was a player that I think I tried to mock trade Jalen Suggs to the Raptors before he popped for Orlando like 100 times because he was struggling. He was losing minutes. I think even this offseason, I tried to trade Jalen Green to the Raptors again, or maybe it was last offseason. I thought about it. So again, you see these players that are struggling. If the team that they're struggling on does not know what they have in them, and you can see a pathway forward for them to succeed, then you would see that. So we talked about the young player on a really good team. We've talked about the player who needs a change of scenery. We can certainly, throw in the player who maybe has had a rough injury go, or maybe a player that you think you'll be better at developing than another team. There's also, of course, the type of player that is just, as I mentioned earlier, just in the wrong system. So you need to really have a clear assertion of what you're doing as a basketball team, who you're building around, and what types of players fit in that system, right? It's plug and play. There are teams that are doing similar things to the Toronto Raptors, and those are probably going to be the hardest teams to trade with, ironically. The Sacramento Kings, who we already did a trade with, are a hard team to trade with because they also need defenders. We need defenders. They need movement shooters. We need movement shooters. They need cutters. We need cutters. So the deal with these two teams is always going to be like one team is taking on something they really don't need, right? But then you take a team like the New York Knicks, philosophically very different teams, very different styles. And so what doesn't work for them might work for you, right? And what doesn't work for you might work for them. So therein lies the sort of situation is like you start observing teams and you're seeing your sort of free flowing, super up tempo offense, which is everyone's egalitarian. You're leading the league in assists. And you're like, man, can we just go find the team that's like the lowest in assists? Can we find like the bottom half offensive rating teams? Because again, players' value subjectively is related to their statistical output. So if you have a player who is maybe just underperforming in a really, really bad offense, their numbers are going to look even worse. And again, when you come to the trade table, if they're shooting 31%, it doesn't really matter why they're shooting 31%. They're still a 31% shooter. And if they have a track record of great shooting, maybe they'll survive it. But, a player like Davion Mitchell, it's really hard right now. He's shooting 30% to be like, to go to the table and be like, hey, we're going to give you this lights out shooter. He shot 36% last year. He's shooting 30% this year. People are like, get the fuck out of here. But if Davion Mitchell shoots like 40% for this year, like if he just, I don't know, goes on a heater for the next few weeks, and at the trade deadline, he's a 40% three-point shooter. If you can develop that part of him, suddenly you're talking about a completely different asset, right? So I don't know. And then of course, there is that player, as I mentioned earlier, that player that is about to expire and the team just can't afford them. The Immanuel Quickley, right? Immanuel Quickley allegedly wanted $25 million from the Knicks, right? And the Knicks saw him as a backup guard. They saw no pathway to starting an undersized backcourt. Tibbs did not want to do that. So there's no pathway to him starting. There's no chance they're paying $25 million for a backup guard. So it took somebody reimagining him away from his role to see him as something more. Is there a backup right now? Consider what the Knicks did, ironically, with Isaiah Hartenstein, right? Now, initially, they brought him in from the LA Clippers. He was the best backup in the league, per my estimate. He was the best backup in the league. And then he went to the Knicks and he earned very little money for the Knicks. He was a backup center. You see what I mean? He was a backup center for the Clippers. And unfortunately, he entered the negotiation table as a free agent as a backup center. And he got paid, unfortunately, according to that, I think he got paid $8 million, which is criminally insane when you think about what other bigs were getting paid. But he was a backup center and his numbers were that, right? And now, because of Mitchell Robinson's injury, the catch 22 of it, he gets to start. They see him in the starting role, and suddenly he's thriving. I'll guarantee you right now, if the Raptors were 7-2, and Davion Mitchell was shooting like 38% from three and wasn't as cheeks as he's been so far, there would be a completely different trade market for Davion Mitchell right now. And you just have to think about that. So if it works for you one way, it's probably working against you in another way. And so you just have to look at teams that are struggling right now. Teams like the Philadelphia 76ers, teams like the Milwaukee Bucks. And you just have to look at the whole train wreck and say, yeah, it's not going well. But Gershon Yabusele is pretty damn good, isn't he? That's kind of what I mean. Anyways, make sure to give this video a like if you found it informative, if you found it interesting. We got you linked up with 3 lives today. This is the first one. The second one is going to happen at 8:30 when we are going to break down the Raptors 905 Chomche. I'm so excited. I'm so excited to watch that game. If you're someone who is looking for, where to watch that game will be on Tubi on the G League TV channel. So we will definitely be breaking down that game, breaking down plays just like we do with the Raptors game. And then at 1 a.m. after the Raptors versus the Clippers, we're going to be breaking that down. So 3 lives today. This is the first one. I hope it was a good one. I hope it was interesting. I hope it wasn't too repetitive. And Ben Eng saying, great episode today. Thank you so much. And Jason Williams, appreciate the support, brother. Hit the hit the like button, people. Thank you very much, guys. Hit the like button anyway. I very much appreciate it. And yeah, we will do a follow-up episode to this. And tomorrow we got you covered with the draft. So maybe we'll link that up. So we'll talk about like 10 prospects to watch in college, and then we'll talk about 10 prospects to watch across the league. Because one thing that a lot of people don't realize when they talk about scouting is you continue to scout the rest of the league. You're still watching what Dyson Daniels is doing right now in Atlanta. If you're the Raptors, you're watching what Leonard Miller is doing in the G League. You're watching the G League. You're watching the pro game. You're watching Europe. You got to have scouts everywhere because this is a very, very talented world. It is increasingly being scouted. There aren't a lot of corners in the world that are super under-scouted, so it's very rare that you're going to have a Bruno Caboclo pop out of nowhere in Brazil and no one's heard of him. That's very rare. And so, again, with social media, everyone knows everything. There's too much information right now. So if you're the Toronto Raptors, how do you compete? You just got to get deeper. You got to scout earlier. You got to scout better. You got to use better models because this is an arms race. Everybody wants the same thing to some extent. They want to win, but everybody has a different idea of how to do that. And you just have to be, there's this old adage, in order to be successful, two things must be true. You must be a contrarian and you must be right. The Raptors have been right about RJ Barrett. They've been right about Immanuel Quickley. They've been right about Grady Dick. They've been right about Ochai Agbaji. We will see if they are right about Jacoby Walter. I think they're right about Jonathan Mogbo. We will see if they are right about Jamal Shead. We will see if they are right about Chomche. But wouldn't it be great? And Jamison Battle. Throw in Jamison Battle in there. And let's see, Davion Mitchell. And maybe there's, more of this to come. But I think the Raptors have completed one of the fastest rebuilds that I've ever seen. And while it's not completely complete because there are 5 draft picks coming up in the next two drafts, it's worth noting that they only had 3 when they started out this process. And they might have 7 by the time this year is out. Talk to you guys later. Have a good one.